Most people assume that when rules change, they are announced loudly, debated publicly, and delayed long enough for everyone to react. That assumption is comforting. It suggests that if something truly matters to your money, your savings, or your assets, you will hear about it in time. But that is not how modern financial systems actually operate. Some of the most consequential changes do not arrive with press conferences or headlines. They arrive quietly, embedded in technical updates, regulatory adjustments, and reporting requirements that take effect overnight. They are finalized after markets close during weekends or while the public is focused elsewhere. And by the time most people notice the system has already moved on, this isn't coincidence. It is how control systems evolve without triggering resistance. If you own physical silver, you likely believe the primary risks are price volatility, storage, or theft. You may even believe that as long as confiscation is not explicitly announced, your position remains private and secure. That belief rests on an outdated understanding of how financial oversight now works. The real shift does not begin with taking assets. It begins with knowing exactly who holds them. This pattern has appeared before across different eras and different assets. The first step is never seizure. It is classification. Assets that were once treated as personal and private are gradually redefined as reportable, sensitive, or strategically relevant. At that point, ownership still exists, but anonymity quietly disappears. Once this stage begins, the relationship between you and your asset changes, even if the asset itself never moves. The system no longer needs to guess. It no longer needs estimates. It does not need enforcement yet. It only needs visibility. Silver has now entered that stage. Nothing was taken. No doors were knocked on. No accounts were frozen. Yet something fundamental shifted. The difference between a private holding and a tracked asset is not philosophical. It is operational. It determines what can happen next when conditions change and who has leverage when they do. Most people will not realize this transition has occurred until they try to act and discover that the rules they relied on no longer apply. By then, the system will not be adjusting. It will already be enforcing. Most people assume that when rules change, they are announced loudly, debated publicly, and delayed long enough for everyone to react. That assumption is comforting. It suggests that if something truly matters to your money, your savings, or your assets, you will hear about it in time. But that is not how modern financial systems actually operate. Some of the most consequential changes do not arrive with press conferences or headlines. They arrive quietly embedded in technical updates, regulatory adjustments, and reporting requirements that take effect overnight. They are finalized after markets close during weekends or while the public is focused elsewhere. By the time most people notice, the system has already moved on. This isn't coincidence. It is how control systems evolve without triggering resistance. If you own physical silver, you likely believe the primary risks are price volatility, storage, or theft. You may even believe that as long as confiscation is not explicitly announced, your position remains private and secure. That belief rests on an outdated understanding of how financial oversight now works. The real shift does not begin with taking assets. It begins with knowing exactly who holds them. This pattern has appeared before across different eras and different assets. The first step is never seizure. It is classification. Assets that were once treated as personal and private are gradually redefined as reportable, sensitive, or strategically relevant. At that point, ownership still exists, but anonymity quietly disappears. Once this stage begins, the relationship between you and your asset changes even if the asset itself never moves. The system no longer needs to guess. It no longer needs estimates. It does not need enforcement yet. It only needs visibility. Silver has now entered that stage. Nothing was taken. No doors were knocked on. No accounts were frozen. Yet something fundamental shifted. The difference between a private holding and a tracked asset is not philosophical. It is operational. It determines what can happen next when conditions change and who has leverage when they do. Most people will not realize this transition has occurred until they try to act and discover that the rules they relied on no longer apply. By then, the system will not be adjusting. It will already be enforcing. At this point, many people instinctively look for the wrong signal. They ask whether silver has been banned, whether confiscation has been announced, or whether prices have reacted. When none of those things appear to be happening, they conclude that nothing meaningful has changed. That reaction is understandable, but it is also precisely why this stage works. The most dangerous shifts in financial control do not announce themselves through dramatic action. They begin by altering what the system can see. As long as an asset is difficult to identify, trace, or map at scale, enforcement remains expensive and politically risky. Once that asset becomes visible, everything else becomes optional. This isn't coincidence. Modern systems do not move from freedom to force in one step. They move from opacity to clarity, and only later, from clarity to control. This pattern has appeared before, and every time it does, the public focuses on the wrong question. They ask whether ownership is still legal. That question misses the point. Ownership can remain legal, while access, movement, and discretion quietly erode. An asset does not need to be confiscated to be neutralized. It only needs to be monitored. Once the stage begins, price becomes secondary. Liquidity becomes conditional. Privacy becomes provisional. The rules you thought governed your relationship with the asset continue to exist on paper, but they are no longer the rules the system relies on operationally. Silver has long been treated by individual holders as something outside the financial grid, physical, tangible, and disconnected. That belief is what made it feel safe. But safety in modern systems does not come from being tangible. It comes from being unimportant to the data layer. When reporting thresholds change, when classifications shift, and when aggregation becomes possible, the asset is effectively pulled into the system whether the holder consents or not. What matters now is not whether silver is being targeted today, but whether it has become legible. History shows that once an asset enters that category, the timeline is no longer controlled by the owner. It is controlled by conditions, by policy responses, and by events that have nothing to do with individual intent. At that point, the question is no longer whether something will happen, but when the system decides it needs to act. To see why reporting changes matter more than they appear, it is necessary to look beneath the surface language of compliance and understand what reporting actually does inside a modern financial system. Reporting is often framed as paperwork, as a passive disclosure requirement that exists only for record keeping. In reality, it is an activation mechanism. It converts a physical asset into a data object, and data is what systems are built to act upon. Once reporting expands, the system no longer depends on assumptions or market surveys. It relies on structured inputs. Transactions become linked to identities. Holdings become associated with locations, intermediaries, and timestamps. What once existed as scattered fragments of information becomes a coherent map. This is not about a single purchase or a single owner. It is about aggregation at scale. This isn't coincidence. Large institutions do not design oversight systems to observe individual behavior in isolation. They design them to detect concentration, correlation, and exposure. When enough data points exist, the system begins to understand not just who owns silver, but how much is held, where it sits, how often it moves, and which channels it depends on to function. At that point, enforcement no longer requires new laws. It requires only operational decisions. One of the most misunderstood aspects of this process is the role of intermediaries. Dealers, custodians, insurers, transport providers, and financial institutions do not need to be instructed to restrict behavior directly. They respond to risk. When reporting requirements expand, so does liability. Compliance costs rise, ambiguity becomes dangerous. As a result, intermediaries adjust their policies, voluntarily tightening terms, delaying transactions, or limiting services. Control emerges not from force, but from risk management. Once this stage begins, access becomes conditional even without prohibition. An asset can remain legal to own while becoming difficult to move. It can remain valuable while becoming hard to convert. The system does not need to seize anything if it can influence when, how, and whether transactions occur. This is how functional control replaces legal control. This pattern has appeared before, not just in metals, but in banking capital flows and currency systems. Reporting creates visibility. Visibility enables modeling. Modeling enables scenario planning. And scenario planning prepares the system to act quickly when conditions change. By the time a crisis arrives, decisions are no longer improvised. They are executed from playbooks that were written quietly long in advance. Once this stage begins, discretion shifts away from the holder. Timing becomes external. Flexibility narrows. The individual still owns the asset, but the system governs the pathways through which that ownership can be expressed. This distinction is subtle, but it is critical. Ownership without autonomy behaves very differently under stress. What makes this mechanism particularly effective is that it does not feel like enforcement while it is being built. Each adjustment appears technical. Each change is justified as administrative or preventative. No single step triggers alarm, but together they transform how power is distributed within the system. Silver's transition into a reporting framework is not significant because of what it does today. It is significant because of what it enables tomorrow. Reporting does not create outcomes on its own. It creates optionality for the system. And optionality, once established, rarely goes unused when pressure rises. When people hear warnings about tracking and reporting, the most common response is disbelief. They assume that if a system were truly preparing to intervene, it would do so openly and immediately. History shows the opposite. Control has almost never begun with confiscation. It begins with information. This pattern has appeared before, and the historical record is consistent on one critical point. Systems do not move against assets they cannot already see. In the early 1930s, when the United States moved to restrict private gold ownership, the confiscation order did not emerge in a vacuum. It was preceded by banking controls, reporting requirements, and emergency authorities that expanded the government's visibility into deposits and transactions. By the time Executive Order 6102 was announced, the infrastructure to identify and enforce compliance already existed. The order did not create control, it activated it. A similar sequence unfolded in the United Kingdom after the Second World War. Capital controls were not introduced by immediately banning private holdings or foreign assets. They began with disclosure licensing and reporting obligations, framed as temporary stabilization measures. Access to funds became conditional long before ownership was formally restricted. These controls remained in place for decades, long after the emergency that justified them had passed. The same structure can be observed in currency systems. Before restrictions on cash withdrawals, cross-border transfers, or account access are imposed, reporting always expands first. Thresholds are lowered. Transaction data is centralized. Financial institutions are made responsible for monitoring behavior. By the time limits are enforced, resistance is minimal because the system already knows where pressure can be applied. This isn't coincidence, it is structural necessity. Large-scale intervention requires precision. Without reliable data, enforcement is blunt, politically costly, and error-prone. With data, intervention becomes targeted, incremental, and defensible. History shows that governments consistently choose the latter path when possible. What is often misunderstood is the timing. Many of these measures were introduced years before they were used. In some cases, decades passed between the creation of reporting frameworks and their full activation. During that time, public attention faded, normalization set in. What once felt intrusive became routine. Once this stage begins, reversals are rare. Reporting systems tend to expand and not contract. Temporary measures acquire extensions. Emergency authorities persist. Each iteration builds on the last, justified by continuity rather than necessity. The lesson from these examples is not that confiscation is inevitable, but that preparedness is deliberate. Systems do not wait for crises to build the tools they need. They build the tools first and wait for conditions to justify their use. Silver's movement into a more visible, reportable category follows this historical logic precisely. It does not signal immediate action. It signals readiness. And history shows that once readiness exists, outcomes are driven not by debate, but by circumstance. Understanding this precedent matters because it reframes what is happening now. The absence of dramatic enforcement is not evidence of safety. In every historical case where assets were eventually constrained, the quiet phase looked exactly like this one. When this model is applied to the present, silver stands out not because it is exotic, but because it sits at an uncomfortable intersection the system cannot ignore. It is both a monetary metal and an industrial input. It is held widely by private individuals, yet relied upon by supply chains tied to energy, electronics, and infrastructure. The dual role makes silver uniquely easy to reframe when conditions tighten. Gold is typically treated as a reserve asset. Its ownership is politically sensitive and symbolically charged. Silver does not carry the same weight. It can be discussed as a commodity problem rather than a monetary one. That distinction matters because it lowers the threshold for administrative action. An asset framed as essential to production can be subjected to reporting and prioritization without invoking debates about currency or sovereignty. The holder profile amplifies this effect. A large share of physical silver in the United States is owned by individuals over 60, many of whom acquired it as a hedge against inflation or systemic risk. These holders value tangibility and privacy, but they also tend to operate within conventional channels. They buy from established dealers, store through recognizable services, and rely on insured logistics. Those channels are precisely where reporting and compliance layers concentrate. This isn't coincidence. Systems exert control most efficiently where behavior is predictable and intermediated. At the same time, silver's market structure makes it sensitive to friction. Unlike purely financial assets, it depends on movement. It must be transported, stored, insured, and exchanged physically. Each of those steps creates a point of contact with institutions that respond to regulatory pressure. When reporting expands, those institutions adjust first, not because they are directed to, but because they cannot absorb open-ended risk. What this means in practical terms is that silver does not need to be targeted directly to be affected. Small changes at the reporting level ripple outward. A dealer alters terms. A carrier delays shipments. An insurer tightens coverage. None of these actions are framed as restrictions. They are framed as compliance, yet collectively they reshape how and when silver can be used. The present environment adds another layer. Supply chains are already strained. Industrial demand remains elevated. Policy frameworks increasingly link materials to strategic objectives. In such a context, visibility is not neutral. It is leverage. Once an asset becomes legible within a stressed system, its treatment is no longer determined solely by the owner's intent. It is shaped by priorities, external to that owner priorities, that can shift quickly when conditions change. This is why applying the pattern to silver now is not speculative. The structural prerequisites are visible, the classifications exist, the reporting pathways are active, the intermediaries are adapting. None of this guarantees a specific outcome, but it does establish a direction. And in systemic shifts, direction is what determines who retains options and who discovers that options have narrowed without warning. At this stage, the most important shift is not legal, but structural. Once tracking is established, the system no longer needs to move quickly. Time begins to work in its favor, not yours. The existence of data changes the balance of optionality. You may still own the asset, but you no longer control when decisions affecting it are made. This isn't coincidence. Control systems are designed to delay visible action until pressure makes action acceptable. When conditions are calm, visibility alone is sufficient. When conditions tighten, visibility becomes the foundation for selective enforcement. The transition does not require new laws or dramatic announcements. It requires only a change in context. Once this stage begins, reversibility disappears quietly. Reporting frameworks do not roll back when attention fades. Databases are not dismantled when emergencies pass. Instead, they persist, justified by continuity and normalized by routine. What was once exceptional becomes administrative. What was once optional becomes assumed. At that point, outcomes no longer depend on intent or compliance. They depend on timing. An individual holder cannot predict when a shortage, a policy response, or a political imperative will elevate one asset above others. But when that moment arrives, the system does not pause to gather information. It acts on what it already knows. This is the core inevitability. Tracking does not guarantee confiscation, restriction, or forced resolution, but it guarantees preparedness. It ensures that if intervention becomes desirable, it can occur without friction, debate, or delay. For the individual, that distinction matters. The risk is no longer whether ownership remains legal today. The risk is that autonomy erodes long before legality changes. And by the time that realization sets in, the window to respond has already narrowed. In systemic transitions, the decisive moment is rarely visible. It is embedded in the infrastructure that precedes action. Once that infrastructure is complete, outcomes are no longer shaped by warning signs. They are shaped by necessity. And necessity does not announce itself in advance. When systems shift in this way, the most damaging position is not taking the wrong action. It is assuming that no action is required. Once tracking exists, inaction is no longer neutral. It becomes a choice to remain fully exposed to whatever constraints emerge next. At this point, the landscape divides into a small number of strategic postures. Each carries trade-offs and none is universally correct. What matters is understanding which posture you're in and why. Some holders will decide to do nothing. They will accept that rules evolve, that compliance is the cost of stability, and that the system will likely move slowly. This choice prioritizes simplicity and familiarity. It also accepts that flexibility may be reduced later, not by decree, but by circumstance. Others will focus on clarity. They will seek to understand exactly how their holdings are categorized, which intermediaries sit between them and their assets, and where reporting obligations actually apply. This posture does not attempt to outrun the system. It attempts to remove ambiguity. In periods of transition, ambiguity is often more dangerous than restriction because it leaves individuals reacting instead of planning. The third posture emphasizes adaptability. Rather than treating ownership as a static condition, it treats it as a structure that can be arranged in different ways. This does not imply evasion or defiance. It reflects the reality that how an asset is held, accessed, and transacted can matter as much as the asset itself when conditions tighten. Flexibility in this sense is not about speed. It is about optionality. What unites these approaches is timing. Early in a transition, choices exist. Pathways remain open. Adjustments are administrative rather than urgent. Later options collapse quickly, not because rules suddenly change, but because systems shift from observation to execution. This is why awareness matters more than prediction. You do not need to know what will happen next to understand that the window for low-friction decisions does not remain open indefinitely. In every historical case, those who retained autonomy were not the ones who guessed outcomes correctly. They were the ones who recognized the phase they were in and acted before urgency replaced choice. This moment is still defined by choice. That will not always be true. At this point, one question naturally follows everything that has been laid out so far. If tracking is now in place, if the infrastructure exists, and if flexibility narrows, as systems move from observation to execution, then attention inevitably shifts away from theory and toward behavior. Specifically, it shifts toward those who understand these transitions best. Large institutions, sophisticated holders, and individuals closest to the system do not wait for public confirmation. They respond to signals, not announcements. They act during the quiet phase when changes still appear technical and reversible. History shows that by the time rules feel obvious to the public, positioning has already occurred elsewhere. So the next issue is not whether the system is changing. That much is already visible. The issue is what informed actors did during the brief window between reclassification and constraint. In the next video, we will examine a narrow time frame, a short window in which behavior shifted before rules became widely understood. Not speculation, not theory, but observable movement. Because once you see how that window was used, you understand how late the broader public usually is, and why timing more than prediction determines outcomes during systemic transitions.